Well, Yale's a great example because Yale was one of what happened with the Halloween costume debacle at Yale was one of the first videos that was released that made people horrified, where they couldn't believe how students were communicating with professors.
Yeah, well, the student who screamed up a storm about that the male professor who was the husband of the woman who wrote the pro-Halloween costume letter, it turned out she was on the bloody hiring committee that hired him. One of the things she screamed was, "Who hired you?" It was like, well, it turned out it was you because you were on the committee just a few years before. I know, and they took, like, yeah, that was absolutely
Explain
appalling.
that to people that don't know what the hell we're talking about.
Well,
explain this debacle, because it really was about questionable Halloween costumes.
Well, it was about questioning Halloween costumes. Halloween costumes are part of the whole point of Halloween is to have questionable costumes, right? You play with death,
Right.
for example, and decay and horror, and it's a time when the norms with regards to the expression of things that are outside of our normal behavior are suspended so that everybody can have a little celebration. As it turns out, well, you know, campuses have got all upset about things like cultural appropriation. At Queen's University in Canada just the other week, they were going after students who were dressing up as Viet Cong, for example, or Mexicans. It's like, I just don't see what the hell's racist about dressing up like a Mexican. Mexicans have a traditional clothing. There's nothing wrong with Mexicans, so why is it wrong to dress up like them?
Right.
And
if you want to be Pancho Villa for Halloween, what's wrong with that?
well, you can regard that as an homage just as much as a denigration. It's
Absolutely.
like, why is that such a problem?
Right.
But anyways, it doesn't matter because nothing's too trivial to be a problem to a social justice warrior, and because they don't like to deal with real problems. And Yale went after Halloween costumes.
So this woman wrote a letter saying maybe we should just relax about this stuff and, you know, don't put restrictions on what people wear for Halloween, but let people decide what is and isn't offensive.
Yes, and well, and many Halloween costumes are offensive. That's the point.
But her letter wasn't really reasonable.
Yeah, it was perfectly reasonable. It was like an adult wrote it.
Yes.
Yeah, and you know, all hell broke loose.
All hell broke loose.
And she ended up quitting.
And I think he did. Did
no,
he
I don't
leave?
think. I don't think he left. But she did.
Seeing him bow down to this woman screaming at him, swearing in his face, was so disturbing. It was so humiliating. I felt so humiliated for him because she was screaming, "This is our home. What the fuck are you doing? You're not making this safe."
And it's not her bloody home. The university's not a home.
Right.
It's not a safe space. It's not a secure space. None of that. And if that when a university isn't a home, that's not what it is. It's a place to be confronted by, I would say, often horrible ideas. You want to learn about history? You think that's going to be safe? Do you know what human history is like? It's an endless bloodbath with a certain amount of hopeful progress underlying it. It's a horror show, and great literature is like that, and biology is terrifying, and physics is terrifying, and you want to be safe. It's stay home with your mom, stay home with your dad. Don't come to university if you want to be safe. Because
don't even go outside.
No, why don't if the university is going to make you safe, then it ceased to be a university. So one of the things I try to do in my class, I have this class called Maps of Meaning, which concentrates on atrocity, basically, on Soviet atrocity and Nazi atrocity mostly. And what I try to do in the class is to teach my students that had they been in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, they would have been Nazis. And had they been offered the opportunity to be an Auschwitz camp guard, then maybe they would have leapt at it. And maybe they would have been in the more sadistic proportion of the Auschwitz camp guard population. You think that makes you feel safe? It doesn't make you feel safe to know that Nazis were humans and you happen to be one of them. And so I think that educators that tell students that they're offering them a safe space are doing them a profound disservice. And you don't... I'm a clinical psychologist, and here's one of the things you do to make people less afraid. You don't make the world safer. What you do is people tell you what they're afraid of, and then you break it into little bits so that they can go confront them. You know, so maybe they're afraid of going to a party, and you break that down. You say, well, do you know how to introduce yourself? And they say, well, I don't really even know how to shake someone's hand. And so then you practice having them shake their hand and introduce themselves, because maybe they weren't taught by that by their half-witted parents when they were young, because they were ignored. And so then you say, well, maybe you can go to a party for half an hour and all you have to do is introduce yourself to 2 people and we'll call that success. And you build up their competence and their confidence one step at a time. And what happens, the clinical literature indicates quite clearly, is you don't make people less anxious by doing that. You make them braver. It's not the same thing. You don't make the world and its horrors smaller. You make the person and their capacity to deal with horror larger. You encourage them. You strengthen them. That's what you do at a university. You arm people with arguments. You hone their intellect. You help them learn to write so they can marshal their arguments. You help them learn how to engage in intellectual combat, because that's better than engaging in real combat. And you make them hard and strong. You don't mollycoddle them and make them safe unless you're their enemy, unless you're trying to devour their spirit. And that's what we have in the universities. We have the reign of the Oedipal mother whose answer to everything is, oh, just come a little closer, dear, and I'll protect you from the world. It's just like Hansel and Gretel's, the witch in the Hansel and Gretel story. Well, my house is made of gingerbread. Just come in here and everything will be fine. Well, she feeds you candy to fatten you up so she can eat you. That's the archetype of a modern university.
When did this start? When did the trigger warnings? When did the safe spaces? When did all this emerge?
Well, it has its roots in the student radicalism of the 1960s, especially the far left radicalism. It really popped up in the 1990s, in the early 90s, when I was teaching in the U.S. at that point. And
which university?
I taught at Harvard from 93 to 98. And there was a fair push for political correctness, especially in the early part of the 90s. But it got pushed back down and disappeared and went underground. It went underground is more accurate. And then it's just come back with a vengeance in the last 5 years. And I think it's partly because we have all these radical left political activist departments at the universities, women's studies being at the top of the list, that have done nothing for the last 30 years. It's even longer than that now. It's almost 40 years. 30 years, let's say. Have done nothing but produce a never-ending stream of ideologically minded counter-civilization political activists. And that's all subsidized by tuition and by the public purse. And that's another thing we really got to ask ourselves, is why the hell are we subsidizing revolution? Why are we doing that? It's crazy. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous.
What exactly is going on with women's studies that you believe is fostering revolution?
Well, you go on their websites and read what they say. I mean, first of all, for the women's studies types, and this is what would you call it? False anthropology. There's this idea that way back when there was a feminist paradise, and that would be like noble savage mode of living where everything was egalitarian and women dominated. It was a matriarchal culture. And that was put forward by a UCLA anthropologist named Gembutes. I can never pronounce her name properly, but I think I got it. And then that was overthrown by patriarchal institutions, essentially starting at about the time, say, of Judaism. And that was all overthrown, and ever since then we've lived in an oppressive patriarchy. And now that's what our culture is. It's an oppressive patriarchy.
So they're pointing to one unsuccessful society that they believe existed, or did it actually exist?
No, it didn't exist. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. It's complicated, but it's the telling of a kind of psychological myth as if it was history.
Whoa.
And anyway, so the basic claim is that Western civilization is a brutish patriarchy, and that whatever positive things it might have managed to accomplish were all accomplished as a consequence of oppression and theft, and that the appropriate thing to do is to restructure it from the bottom up. And they mean that. They mean every single bloody concept. And you can marry that with modern postmodernism and throw in a nice dash of Marxism, and you have the ideological and motivated grounds for social revolution. And I'm just go online and look at a dozen women's studies websites. Just read them. You can see what they say. They produce political activists, and their goal is to restructure the patriarchy. Well, what's the patriarchy? Well, the patriarchy is Western civilization. And what does restructure mean? That's easy. It means tear it down and destroy it. Why? because it's a brutish system that's predicated on nothing but oppression. It's nothing but a tyranny in the eyes of the radical women's studies types. Heterosexuality, that's a tyranny. Capitalism, that's a tyranny. Democracy, well, that doesn't even exist, and even if it did, it would be a tyranny. Everything's a tyranny. And so you can ask these, and what would they replace it with? They replace it with their own ideological utopia. Well, we've already had 100 years of that. We saw what happened. Oh, well, that doesn't matter. That wasn't real Marxism. That's what the bloody Marxists always say. That wasn't real Marxism. It's like, oh, how many millions of people have to die before you're convinced that it's real Marxism? And I know what they mean by that, too. They mean, hey, if I was the Marxist dictator, things would have gone a lot better. It's like, you should think again, sunshine. If you were the Marxist dictator, things wouldn't have gone a lot better. So, and if you're the sort of person that thinks that if you would have been in control, things would have gone a lot better, then you're exactly the sort of person who should never be in control. So, and it's resentment. It's horrible resentment.